can join at the desk or online, and we'd love to have you because it's a really vibrant society, and I've just read the history, so I actually can now tell you something about it if you need to know. Now, today's speaker is Daphne Henderson, and she's not the ex-matron of Seacliff, because that closed 50 years ago. She is someone that worked at Seacliff and had a lot of family members that worked there, so Daphne's going to give us a really good rundown. I don't know if people go out there, but it's an absolutely beautiful park now. I take the dog and we go for a run, and there's a plaque there for Janet Frame under a tree she used to sit under, so it's really worth going. So I hand over to Daphne. Welcome.
Good morning. I was quite surprised to find I was advertised as elevated to the position of matron of Seacliff. As was said, I did work at Seacliff, first as a hospital aide and then as a student nurse. But later at Cherry Farm I did become assistant matron, and for a very brief period before it was closed I was the principal nurse. I wanted to share with you some aspects of Seacliff's history and the man who shaped it. Now, Seacliff Hospital or Seacliff Asylum, I absolutely hate hearing people saying that when they walk in the grounds they can feel the evil vibe, or it was a place of horror and torture. What it was, in the era it was, well, in comparison to the rest of Australasia, and in some cases to the rest of the world, Seacliff is actually at times very revolutionary. And there's a group of us who want to preserve the history of Seacliff. Young student nurses and doctors today, when I say Seacliff, oh, what was that? And many of us have several generations of family that worked at Seacliff, including my own, that went back to the early 1900s, and some connections back to the 1800s. But that beautiful building loomed very large in our childhood. Now, this is a painting by George O'Brien done in the 1880s for Robert Arthur Lawson. It's what he wanted the asylum to look like after he was commissioned to be the architect.
You have to push it on. Oh, it's not showing.
I was going the wrong way. It's often the fault with me. Well, where to start a story? I chose, like the song, The Beginning. In the 1840s, the Otago Provincial Council was convinced that England might have sent its convicts to Australia, but Scotland was sending its mentally enfeebled to Otago. Families were paying ship's captains to take them to the other side of the world so they wouldn't be their responsibility any longer. It was a problem in the new settlement, however. Dunedin at that stage only had a population of barely 2,000, and there was no option but to deport them again back to Scotland and fine the ship's captains so that practice would stop. Then a jail became necessary. I never quite found where the first original immigration barracks were, but it was added on to there. And at this stage of our history's development, those who were suffering from any form of mental illness were kept restrained in prison cells. Then, in 1851, the first hospital was built on the site where the town hall now stands, and 5 beds were allocated to what they then called lunatics. I know that's no longer PC. Now, if you walk down the lane from the Octagon down to the library, about 5 paces in, underneath that first window, you'll see a wee plaque informing you that the site was the first hospital from 1851 to 1886. It then moved to where it stands today, but no longer looking like this, I guess. And goodness knows what we're going to get. As you know, when gold was discovered in Otago, there was a rapid increase in the 1960s of population, and the number of beds required in that little hospital for mental health care rose to more than 30, more than the hospital could cope with. So the Otago Provincial Council purchased 5 acres in Arthur Street from where the playground is today. It was a cemetery, and City Road right through to Stewart Street where Otago Boys High School is. There was an original building on the site. It had been an army barracks to train South Island soldiers for the Maori Wars in 1945. It was sufficient to accommodate 50, but the numbers very quickly rose to somewhere around 300. Not only did they outgrow the facility, but locals around complained that it was noisy and smelly. And according to records, the Provincial Council didn't want an asylum on its doorstep, so they withheld permission for them to have running water and drainage. So bath days were seemingly very few and far between, because the water had to be carted from that spring that's along where the bowling green used to be, along Arthur Street. And in the records it says that they had to use 6 to 9 people for a bath. And I guess the water was cold too. The asylum had to be self-sufficient, so on that site they had pigs and cows and hens. And the residents began to complain, of course. Now, it was very difficult to get staff. Nobody wanted to work there, so they had to roster police and prison guards to keep control in the institution. Now, by this time, the provincial government had been overtaken by our first national government, and they agreed in 1877 to build an asylum on English models. They looked at land at Milton, possibly around about where the prison is now. They looked at Lookout Point, but that was going to be too close. The city was spreading out in that direction. So they finally settled on 900 acres at Beaconsfield, which of course is now Seacliff. Originally, there were, patients from the institution in Arthur Street began dismantling, along with staff supervision, the buildings there and transporting them to Seacliff. They were going to be temporary dwellings while the big building was built. But in actual fact, they were still there and still in use in 1972 when the hospital closed. Now, patients and staff were given the task of digging the foundations and clearing the land, and the main construction began in 1879. It took 5 years to complete that building, and for 50 years it was the largest building in Australasia. And it cost £100,000 to build. Poor Robert Arthur Lawson, who was the architect, had arguments with the council, with the builders. There was controversy about that site right from the beginning. The first foundation holes that were dug overnight, they just all filled in. In fact, when those first foundations were dug, they found Noah bones, which are now in the museum. When the building was nearly completed, the woodwork around the windows and the doors had begun buckling, and in the north wing, the plaster was, as quick as they put it on the ceiling, was falling off again. Now, the building was completed and began to be occupied by 1884. It was built to accommodate 500 patients, which is thought they were as many as I was going to need, and 50 staff. But 3 years later, by 1887, stones has begun to fall off the buildings, the towers and the turrets had begun to get a lean, and then there was a major slip which caused considerable damage to the north wing and it had to be completely destroyed. And so they built a wooden construction then, and anything after built at Seacliff was wooden. Now, there was a government inquiry which found Robert Arthur Lawson, quite wrongly, he was at fault for inadequate foundations and structural defects. There were never any problems with the 35 odd churches that he was responsible for in Otago, or buildings like Otago Boys High School or First Church. But of course it's now well understood that that whole area is geographically unsound. I mean, they can't keep the roads without all those dips in them. Now, in 1889, Dr. Truby King was elected to the chair of Otago Medical School and the position of medical superintendent of the asylum. He took over a hospital with a rapidly increasing number of patients. Only 2 of all those patients, and at that stage it was over 500, could have parole outside the grounds with a staff in charge of them. Only 2 of all those patients. There were, all the doors were locked, and I guess patients were sent to bed at 4:30 or around, or even 4 o'clock after they'd had their evening meal. So within that building there were 2,800 locked doors, internal courtyards, so people there never saw a tree or the outside. There was one large bathroom for males and another large bathroom for females, and different wards had different bath days. And I guess it wasn't on a weekly roster either, it was longer a week before you got a bath. There was one dining room seating 200, and so there were several dining room sittings, and many wards had to go through anything up to 11 locked doors to get from their ward to the dining room and then back again. So he, when he arrived, found the environment, the building was beautiful, but the environment was completely depressing. It was enclosed by dense bush, there was no sanitation, there was malfunctioning drains, barely any plumbing, windows didn't open so there was no ventilation, and all the internal walls were painted a dark institutional green with dark blue trims. Heating was by open fires and they were sparse, and bedrooms were like ice chambers, and their only lighting was oil lamps. So that's why the patients had to be locked in their bedrooms by 4:30, because after dark the staff couldn't see them. Now Dr. King set to work with a plan that he was going to put this all to rights. He started employing new staff, and the males had to either be plumbers, carpenters or painters, and he put them to work with groups of patients to make major improvements inside the building. Now he was a great believer in fresh air, in a strict healthy diet, very high in vegetables and fish, and daily outdoor activity with sports, work, especially agricultural and gardening, and these were all going to be his required treatment, quite different from what happened before. People never allowed outside the building. He introduced literature. He bought with his own money library books for a library. He purchased a piano, violins, flutes, cellos. He organised fortnightly dances for the patients and dances and all sorts of entertainments for patients, staff and villagers. On the top floor of that building was the most magnificent hall with the most fabulous carried beams, and it was so big it could seat 900 people. Now he was expected to live in rooms within the main building, and the staff were quite disgusted when he got government money to build himself this magnificent house in the grounds. It was lived in until 1972 when it closed, and unfortunately the land was all given to Land Corp, and they let the animals from the farm roam all through it, and anybody who came to walk in the grounds helped themselves to anything that was left inside. I think the last time I went there was no doors left, and all the kitchen equipment, etc. had gone. Anyway, Dr. King was very concerned about married men separated from their families. Those who lived in Dunedin travelled to Seacliff by train, lived in for 6 days and then went home again. So at his own expense, he bought a large parcel of land from the Kilgour farm, which was by the railway station, and gave sections to those who wished to build on it. And it's Kilgour Street, still there today. Now, he gave instructions that patients were to remain up till at least 8:30, that recreation rooms were to be made, and there was a billiard table that had been, that's the billiard table, had been donated to patients when they were at Arthur Street, because the rich businessmen in Dunedin had started building big houses around in Melrose, which were behind the baths there. But there was no road, so the patients from the asylum did the first labouring and digging out for where the road was going to go, and so they gave them this billiard table. Now, when it went from Arthur Street to Seacliff, the staff matron went to the staff quarters. And there was a big protest and outcry when Dr. King insisted it go back to the patients' areas. Now, in 1898, he set about the next of his reforms, and he built what came to be known as the cottage. It was absolutely the first in Australasia to have an open ward, no staff. Until he went there, nobody ever got discharged. They were expected to remain there. That's where they were sent, and that's where they were going to remain. But he had a different idea. People could be made well and leave. So the cottage was for women. I think about 15 lived there. They would do their own cooking and housework and get ready to go home. Very sad, really. I guess how things were looked at in those days, especially considering the Mental Health Act, or the Mental Defectives Act as it was called. It was listed you could be an imbecile to be sent to Seacliff or any mental institution, and an imbecile was listed as one who couldn't look after themselves for any reason, a vagrant, an inebriate, a prostitute, an epileptic, or having an illegitimate baby. A later addition was added for being socially defective. I've often looked at that and think, well, there are times probably in my life that I could have fitted that one. Anybody, those that could get you committed there were your doctor, the courts, the police, and families. And no discharge could happen unless your family agreed to take responsibility for you. So Seacliff at one stage, the group of hospitals, had 1,400 patients. And today, between Otago and Southland, there's less than 100. So mainly outpatient service, and I can tell you Dr. Truby King started that too way back in the beginnings of the 1900s, and that was a first in Australasia. The period when he went to Seacliff, it was believed that if you incarcerated these people causing concern, they couldn't reproduce, and if they couldn't reproduce, then, you know, mental health or mental illness would disappear. Now, Seacliff was situated on 900 acres, so after he got the inside of the building the way he wanted, he started organising a farm. He got patients and staff, nearly 400 acres of it, into farmland. They had 200 Friesian milking cows, and they became considered the best milking herd in New Zealand. There were pigs, hundreds of pigs, hundreds of hens. That's Jack Wheeler. He was a family friend, or a friend of my father's in my childhood. I just loved as a child going up to the farm. When the chicks were out, there were literally thousands of little chicks and pigs, hundreds of little piglets. The hospital actually kept Dunedin prison. In fact, the prisons around New Zealand and hospital around New Zealand supplied with meat and vegetables and dairy products, tons of potatoes that the staff and patients harvested. Patients were involved in every aspect of the food chain, from the planting to the harvesting to the butchering in the kitchens. The staff got a bit worried about these patients having knives, but my cousin was the last farm manager, and he tells me that in the farm office there were all the complete records of Dr. Truby King's days. He kept huge diaries, they're now in the National Archives. He brought the best of livestock for the farm, and this is all while he was running a hospital and lecturing in Dunedin University as well. He followed and recorded every detail about the herds that he bought and which breeds gave the best result. And he ended up buying actually 6 farms of his own in the Catlins, which he stocked with what he bought and what he raised. Many of the calves were hand-fed. Oh, I've lost myself. Maybe I haven't got a picture of it. Many of the calves were hand-fed and got, I don't know another name for it, the skitters, but I know that's not the correct term, and died. Now, thank you. I'll change my notes. Now, he experimented with various types of feed. He had pens that were marked and feed buckets, blue, red and green, and calves with corresponding cords of those colours around their necks, so that the patients, when they were feeding them, couldn't get mixed up and, I guess, ruin his research. Now, to prove how well his animal husbandry methods were working, he entered the asylum livestock in every agricultural show it was possible to go to, and won all the prizes for several years. Now, this raised complaints from other competitors. They thought that Dr. King was bribing the judges. So they barred all the asylum's livestock from being entered. They said he could still exhibit. That didn't worry him, because by this time the staff and patients had a large-scale breeding program going and were selling the cattle. So the agricultural shows were a great place to increase their sales. The health department today would have loved it, because the hospital wasn't costing a penny to run, it was actually making money. Now, the farm was above the hospital, and while all that was taking place, he had another plan for the 32 acres below the hospital, and that was going to be a garden. It stretched from the hospital down to the coast road. He planned it and mapped it all out. He supervised all the patients and staff with their wheelbarrows and spades. He had flower seeds and vegetable seeds sent from a firm called H. Connell and Sons in London, supposed to be the best in the world. All the drives and the walks in the gardens were boarded and asphalted. Now, there were no medications at that time. Treatments were controlling and harsh. One of probably, I think, the worst treatments was that they shaved your hair off in the belief that the strength would then go to your brain, not to grow in your hair. Now, Dr. King stopped all those dehumanising treatments and concentrated on beautifying. He'd done the inside and was starting on the outside. He wanted a large garden with winding paths and bridges and ponds to follow his belief that a cure for a sick mind involved beauty and peace in your surroundings. Well, you can't argue with that, can you? Now, also in his plan was people were going to be very much involved in sports. So he had a big sports field built. It's still there today. I think I've run on it myself, probably from about the age of 4 until my teens. There were always annual staff and picnic sports days. I never won a race. My best friend, who later became my sister-in-law, always won, and I always came last. There were baby contests too, and I never won any of them either. Although once, at one of the sports days, I was very impressed with the young man who won the greasy pole contest. Many years later, I married him. Now, we encourage sporting events, a cricket, soccer team, later a rugby team, bowls, all with staff evolved. Clubs from Dunedin he invited out for picnic sports days. He instructed that female nurses had time off to play tennis. And it said then he concentrated on nurses he was recruiting to have the skill to fill the team's sports gaps, so the Seacliff team would be the best. When I started and signing on in the matron's office, she said to me, and matron, great big huge veil and very serious, hockey practice is at 5 o'clock on Tuesday evenings on the sports field. I naively said I don't play hockey. My mother played for Toitū and she still had the evidence of her up her legs where the hockey sticks had hit her. She leaned further forward and said, I said hockey practice. So I went back to the nurses' home and they said, oh, I've been paid to get on the wrong side of matron. But I found they had basketball teams too, so I was saved. Oh, there's one of the sports days. And some of the sports teams. And the tennis courts. Now, this is a very important photo. The Chatham Cup is New Zealand's annual premier soccer tournament. Now, at the end of World War I, the HMS Chatham, an English battleship, was sent on a goodwill tour of the colonies. I don't know if we were the colonies or the empire in those days, but anyway, in Wellington, it gave a copy of the famous FA Cup to the newly formed New Zealand Soccer Association, while in Otago Harbour, a team from the ship's crew were invited out to Seacliff to play a game. The sailors won that game, but that year, 1923, they started the first national Chatham Cup tournament in New Zealand. All the North Island teams played, and the winner was Wellington. I think it was the YMCA team in Wellington. All the South Island teams played, and Seacliff won. So Seacliff went off to Wellington, and they won 4-0 in Wellington. So this team of Seacliff men were the first owners in 1923 of the Chatham Cup. And we kept, and still named it the Seacliff soccer team, right up until 1928. Yes, 1992, when Cherry Farm closed. But unfortunately, its only other claim to success, it made them semi-finals in 1990. Now, we had a house that we renovated in Karitani in 1973, and when we took the wall lining off, the boards behind were absolutely black. And I was told by one of the elders that those poles at the end of your garden, Daphne, were where the jetty stood for Dr. Truby King's Seacliff Asylum fishing fleet. And our house had been the smokehouse. Now, his fishing fleet, and staffed by patients and staff, and caught 8 pounds of fish in 1905, 75 pounds of fish the next year, and on and on and on it went. At one stage, the male nurses living at the ranch house sent in a petition, and would you believe it, the petition said they couldn't stand one more meal of crayfish for tea. The fishing ships were also used in the weekends to take patients on pleasure trips out to sea. Now, Truby King didn't suffer fools lightly. If you weren't following his orders, you were either sacked or severely reprimanded. He sacked people for behaviours that had been previously tolerated. He couldn't stand any violence, he didn't want any patient hit or spoken too harshly, he didn't want any drunkenness. Now, that and his reforms, and moving away from controlling and all this openness that patients could leave and wander where they liked, is even down to the village. It created opposition amongst a number of staff. Now, there was no unions in those days, so they wrote to the government and made official complaint. And these were the men that came down to Wellington to investigate. The complaint said that he was wasteful of public money, built that house, after all. The foods that he supplied to patients and staff, because the staff had to eat the same diet as he insisted upon, was insufficient. The supervision of patients is lax, allowing all sorts of patients to escape. He behaved towards his subordinates in a harsh and unfair manner. He was guilty of gross abuse of power, and he conducts the management of the asylum in such a manner as to be a danger to local residents. They didn't want the patients wandering around, but others in the village did. They helped housewives with housework, childminding, they worked on the farms locally, they did gardens for some of the staff, they went to church with us, they went to the picture hall, but in some eyes of those that have been at Seacliff for a long time, that wasn't the way it should be. And he was cruel to patients, they said, had them working in inappropriate conditions at inappropriate hours, because some got up at 4 o'clock to help milk these 200 cows by hand. But the findings not only exonerated Dr. King, but they led to his ideas becoming standard treatment right throughout New Zealand, and some still true today. Now, one incident that really raised the ire of the staff was Edward Lionel Terry. He'd been born in England in 1873, was educated at Eton and Oxford. His family claimed to be descendants of Napoleon Bonaparte. His father was a wealthy businessman, and Lionel grew into a very unsettled young man, not coping well in the family business. So his father purchased him a commission in the Regiment of Royal Artillery, which I thought was a bit risky, considering he was an unsettled young man. There was some bother, as, you know, true to word, it followed, and he was transferred to the House Guards, and then he was confined to barracks. Now, while he was confined to barracks, he was a very good artist, and he practically wallpapered the mess room with caricatures of all those he didn't like in the army, the colonel and all the officers. His father was then asked to purchase his release. After that, they sent him off to family in South Africa. And that didn't work out well, they sent him back. So the family paid him to go off around the colonies, and he became what was known in those days as a remittance man. Like other English gentlemen that were bothersome to their families, they paid them to go to the colonies and not to return. My husband's great-great-grandfather was one. I tell him it explains a lot. Now, Lionel worked in South Africa, and he actually went for a time to America, labouring alongside people of Negro ethnicity, which he developed an obsessive dislike for. Then he arrived in New Zealand in 1901 and became in contact with the Chinese when he was gold digging. He published a book on the need for racial purity, and in 1905 he set out on a marathon walk all over the North Island, taking in anybody who'd listen about the impending yellow peril which was going to happen. When he arrived in Wellington, he went to see parliamentarians. He wanted them to halt anything that wasn't British immigration. Well, that didn't go down well either. So he thought he had to take things into his own hands. So he went to Chinatown, and on the 25th of September 1905, he shot an elderly Chinaman. Well, I say elderly, Joe Young was only 68. Joe had been on his way down Hanning Street and he died that night in Wellington Hospital. Lionel had already posted a letter to the Governor-General saying what he was going to do and why he had to do it. And after shooting the man, he went to Wellington Police Station and gave him his gun. He was arrested and charged with murder. He conducted his own defence. He was certain that he was right and that his actions were justified. Of course, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. But it was later changed to life imprisonment when he was deemed a little insane. Now, Lionel was 6'4", extremely fit, difficult to manage in Wellington Prison. He attacked prison guards, he set a fire, he escaped several times. Now, he ended up in Littleton after managing to get to the South Island. He was equally problematic in their prison. He was transferred to Sunnyside and he continued escaping. So they thought Seacliff looks more secure, we'll send him to Seacliff. Now from 09 to 014 he was kept in solitary confinement, but he still managed to escape. All his serial escaping, he became quite a folklore, and hundreds of people signed a petition wanting his release. But his family had been mortified about the whole court. It talked about eating his army his whole life. And they didn't want him released. They didn't want him back home. Joe Kum Young had come from China when he was 18 and he worked for 33 years gold mining on the west coast. He'd had an accident and become an invalid for having broken his legs, and he was staying in Wellington because the Wellington Chinese community were going to pay for him to go back to China, but of course he didn't make it. Now, I think I've got, that's Hanning Street. In Hanning Street, 100 years on, on the 25th September 2005, the Chinese community, led by those who were related to Joe, laid a memorial on that plaque where poor Joe had been shot. Now, Dr. King offered Lionel freedom of all the hospital grounds in the village if he'd stop escaping, but Lionel couldn't agree. But on his last escape, Dr. King met him at the railway station. He's been brought back from Invercargill in chains with a police escort, and he promised Dr. King then that he wouldn't escape any longer. That's the plaque there. Now, on his sojourn on the railway station, Dr. King had spied a man painting the water tower grey, and he thought that altogether the station looked a bit shabby. It's an important place, all the hospital supplies, anybody come to Seacliff came via the station. So he went back and he asked the man why he was painting it such a dull colour, and he was told, well, it's railway policy. Dr. King's reported to have replied, well, I'm the King of Seacliff and I don't like it. The man took no notice because he thought, well, that's just a lunatic from the asylum. But some weeks later, the man was seen repainting the water tower in a brighter colour, and patients and staff were digging up all around the railway station, planting gardens and flowers. And true to form, I should say, Dr. King pressured all the little stations up and down that line to hold an annual competition to see who had the best kept station. I don't have to tell you who kept winning. Now, Lionel kept his word. He didn't run away. He made his own garden. He grew flowers, vegetables, beautiful roses. He wrote fabulous poetry and beautiful paintings, which he gave to staff and visitors. I have quite a lot of sketchings that he gave my father, probably in the 1930s, a painting and quite a bit of poetry. He was given his own suite of rooms because he had his own money. He had a small library and his own staff. A male nurse, when I started working, told me when he started at Seacliff, he was rostered as one of Lionel's nurses. He had to behave more like a valet. He had to take in the hot water and the towels in the morning for his wash and ask him what he wanted for his meals for the day. But as time went on, he grew quite out of touch with reality. He wore his hair long, white. He always wore white. He always had a white sheep or goat. Well, I suppose they wear white anyway. Now, that's a self-painting, self-portrait of him. In 1940, he attacked one of the doctors who was attempting to inoculate him against typhoid. And from then on, all his privileges were withdrawn. Dr. King, of course, having long since gone, and he was kept in solitary confinement for the next 12 years until he died in 1952. Now, he had money, and he would always tell the staff that looked after him, "My family don't want me back in England, but make sure I have a funeral and I'm buried in a grave." And so when he died, he went to the mortuary in Seacliff Hospital and then disappeared. And the staff kept asking, "Where's Lionel?" and getting no answer. So they wrote to the Star, and if you look back on papers past, you can find they laid a great complaint. In those days, people that weren't claimed that died at Seacliff were sent to the medical school, and that's where Lionel had gone, against his own wishes. So, with the outcry and the piece in the paper, the body was returned, and it's buried at Orokonui Cemetery, just round from where I live, and I visit him sometimes. Now, Mr. and Mrs. King loved to travel. Now, one time they visited Japan, and he was delighted at the hygiene in the homes he visited, and the babies were fed for at least up to a year and sometimes 18 months, and were much healthier than New Zealand babies. So that inspired him on his return to write a book, as if he didn't have enough to do. But his book sparked considerable female opposition when he wrote, and I guess you'll agree with me. He wrote, "Since children are the future of the nation, it's detrimental to their health and well-being to allow or encourage women to be highly educated. It takes their attention away from their main task in life, which is the raising of their children." Now, he also, bless him, voted against people getting the vote. He set up a campaign against it. And later, he even tried to influence education authorities to test girls different than boys because they had a different IQ. And one other thing, he believed that if women kept a hygienic home, right diet and right fresh air, they wouldn't have any morning sickness, they wouldn't have any labour pains. We know that's bollocks. Now, he published a considerable amount on all sorts of subjects, and including farming and cropping topics. So in 1905, he was asked to speak at Wellington at a farmers' conference, presided over by the then Governor-General, Lord Plunkett. And you can imagine the surprise of all those male audience of hardy farmers when he deviated from talking about animal husbandry to the care and nutrition that's required in raising babies. He told those present that we treat our calves better than we treat our babies. It got the attention of Lord Plunkett though. He and his wife Victoria at that stage were hard-pressed in raising 8 children of their own. Now, he wanted to prove that what he'd written in his methods worked with infants and children. So he and Isabella, his wife, started dropping into people around Seacliff and Karitani and Warrington and giving them advice on child care and etc. He held a public meeting in the town hall in Dunedin, and after that was approached by lots of women. So he started a program in his own home, which he had at Karitani. He set off on a program for children. Everything was done by the clock. There was a time to exercise, there was time for fresh air, there was a time for bathing, there was a time for sleeping, there was a time for feeding. But he found that babies weren't actually mechanical, you couldn't switch them on at night. But the 4-hour feeding stuck. I can remember when I was at Queen Mary, before I left, I was warned, you need to get into a 4-hourly feeding program, or, you know, your whole routine will get out when you get home. I suppose it still happens today, I don't know. Firstly, he employed a Miss McKinnon. and his wife Isabella, and they were training others to be nurses to look after these mothers and babies. And then Karatani Hospital was born from that, and Karatani Nursing was born from that. If you've done a tour of Overston, you can see that the name cards on the table in the dining room indicate those who were present the night they discussed and actually the Plunkett Society was formed. Mrs. Searman had been a great supporter of what Dr. King was trying to do. In 1908, he and Isabella toured around New Zealand because they'd opened Andy Bay Karatani Hospital, and by 1912 they'd opened 60 branches around New Zealand, all with nurses. The Plunkett book had been published by Whitcomb & Tombs in Dunedin. Originally, funnily enough, it was given to all couples who applied for a marriage licence. Of course, there's no Plunkett book any longer. If you see a Plunkett nurse, it goes onto a computer. My mother gave me my Plunkett book when my Jane was born, and same with, I guess, other families. Now, New Zealand, thanks to Dr. King, is recognised as the first country in the world to initiate a childcare system. He was invited to Canada and America and Australia to set up similar systems, and in England he was asked to assist in developing a child health service. And he and Isabella at that stage published in every newspaper in New Zealand a weekly column on how to raise babies. Now, Isabella got concerned about Dr. King's health because he was doing so much, so she took him on a holiday, a boating and camping trip up the river in the Catlins, which I thought was a bit rigorous for a 53-year-old who wasn't particularly well. But it seemed it was just what he needed because he saw all this virgin land, and he ended up buying quite a bit of it before they returned. Up to that point, I didn't know anything about this, but there's a wonderful piece in Papers Past that heads King colonising the Catlins. I don't think that was Andy Bay Hospital. That's Mary that they adopted. Had trouble, of course, because he'd been preaching breast is best, and now what they were going to do. So he set off making formulas like he did with the calves to find out which was the best. Now, firstly, on the land he bought, the trees had to be felled. There was so much timber he didn't know what to do with it, so he opened a timber mill. Then what was he going to do with the timber that he cut? So he supervised the building of a railway. He went back to the Catlins many times, and he ended up with 6 farms. He had, just south of Awaka, one of the most advanced milking sheds in New Zealand. It had a concrete floor, electric lighting, hot water, machine milking. He built a water wheel to power the generator. Cows were led through disinfecting water bath before they got to milking. And he continued in experimenting with feed. He found that the cows liked swedes and did well on them. Huge acres of swedes he built, and I often wonder if he was the first one in Southland to grow a swede. But anyway, his farm was producing 1.5 tonnes of milk daily, which he didn't know what to do with because he couldn't get it out. So he built a cheese factory. He had so much whey left over, he didn't know what to do with that, so he bought more land and started a pig farm. And that was so successful that he was producing something like 30 pigs a month for sale. But getting workers was difficult. So the trains were running, and it's so sad that that Catlin line isn't there any longer. But anyway, he started bringing patients down from Seacliff as part of their rehabilitation to milk the cows and work on the farms. And then, of course, he started invading the workers' houses at his mill. He built them houses, he built them a school, but every time he went down, he would inspect all the houses, the hygiene and the childcare, and he gave $10 to the best family. Now, after World War I, Many returned servicemen suffering from nervous disorders were admitted to Seacliff. He didn't think they should be there, so he took them to his own home in Karatani, and then there were too many. So he got the RSA to give money, and Clifton House was opened. And this was another first. He felt that they were sons, brothers, husbands, separated from their families of year of war. So families, unlike what the rest of the hospital visiting hours were, they could visit any time and be involved in the care. He also believed he could cure alcoholics, and in 1898 he bought Orokonui Boys Home, and he turned it into a place for epileptics and alcoholics. But once again that woman issue came up. He wasn't fussed on admitting women. He thought once they were down and out, pretty hard to get them back up again. He was appointed to another dual position as Child Welfare Inspector and Inspector of Mental Health in Wellington. Have I done something to make that noisy?
I think you just, it was fine till you knocked it, so just put it that way.
Ah, thank you. He took the position at Seacliff.
Just knock that down one, should be right.
He took the position at Seacliff for only 2 years, and he ended up staying 32. He retired in 27. By that time, he'd already begun developing his own place, Melrose in Wellington. If you go to the zoo and go a bit further up the hill, you can find it. He planted roses, azaleas, rhododendrons. He built a huge house. He built a Plunkett hospital, a factory making baby food and formula, and then a mausoleum where he and Isabella are buried. He left it to Plunkett, but Plunkett have since given it to the City Council, but anybody can visit. He was knighted, and then he died on the 10th of February 1938. He was the first private citizen in New Zealand to be given a state funeral. Plunkett nurses, I think I might have a photo. Oh, that's part of his garden. They stood vigil around his coffin, the Plunkett nurses, at night. And government ministers were pallbearers. Walter Nash and Peter Fraser were pallbearers. The Prime Minister, Michael Savage, gave the eulogy. He said that New Zealand owes a great debt of gratitude to Sir Truby King. He was responsible for saving the lives of over 1,000 babies a year. And 20 years after his death, and I think I have a photo of that. Oh, that's up to his mausoleum and his house up on the hill in Melrose. He was the first New Zealander to go on a New Zealand stamp. Now, long after his death in 1942, there was the largest disaster, that fire at Seacliff, the largest disaster and taker of life up until that stage in New Zealand. It was a 2-storey wooden structure, a women's ward, and in spite of the best efforts of staff, it was razed to the ground and only 37 of the 39 patients, 37 of the 39 patients were burnt to death. I think 12 of them were taken by their relatives, and the others were buried in unmarked graves at Andy Bay. And 70 years later, a committee of their relatives started raising money and wanted to build memorials at Andy Bay and on the site at Seacliff where the ward was. They spent a couple of committee meetings in my home. They were going through the history of Seacliff and they wanted some photographs. That's where it was. I was going to talk about Janet Frame and her. You can still see that lovely memorial underneath the tree where she liked to sit, that her niece put there. Now in 1947, the Ministry of Works assessed that the towers and turrets leaning and shaking in the wind were unsafe, and most of them got demolished. 20 years previously, they'd bought land at Cherry Farm to increase their farm produce, and by 1950, the Ministry of Health were putting forth plans to build a hospital on that site. 1958, the Seacliff building was evacuated, and that beautiful building over the next 10 years was completely demolished, replaced by something not as beautiful. That was Mr. Island's tank. It had a ball thing on it that used to smash into the side of the building. My friend and I were teenagers then, or she became my sister-in-law. She used to take hundreds and hundreds of photos, and these are some of hers. She used to go up after school and take photos of the demolition. We used to go on the weekends. Shed many a tear, actually. In the end, they couldn't get it done. They had to dynamite the last part of it. I think that's the very top. So this is what it was like when I started in 1964. It closed completely in 72.
Were the materials reused?
No. They were taken across the road to Reed's Farm and dumped in a big gully. I'd love to go digging there. After it closed in 72, you can see these buildings, these wooden buildings, were all demolished, and I think halls took quite a lot, and quite a lot of people took the copper piping and the slate on the roof. That all got taken away, sold, I presume. And since then, there's been a whole story of changes. It's gone through several hands, and the farm is separately owned and still a farm. Several people have owned the 9 acres where the building was. But the only really good piece that still stands are the stone stables. And I like that because my father's workshop's right on the corner, so I've got somewhere to go. The 32 acres of gardens now owned by the DCC. And it's named, of course, after its creator. And it's got memorials in there to the staff and especially the patients who died in the fire. And that bell, it's at Waikari now, but it's been in my life, all my life, until I retired from Waikari. I used to hear it as a child. They rang it when anything was going on in the hospital and they needed extra staff. They rang it in the morning to assemble all the work gangs that were going out to do various things. It went to Cherry Farm and now it's at Waikari. So for my working life, it was inside the gate of the 3 hospitals I worked in. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Daphne. That was fabulous. I'll open it for questions. Anyone got any questions?
No questions so much, but my aunt, great aunt, was there as well, Frances Law, and of course, getting the train in and out of Dunedin, particularly the coal train from Toitū to Timaru back, so she married the driver, became Frances Howie. But she was asked to be in the truly keen TV thing they did not so long ago, or a while ago I should say, and but she said to them, you know, we nursed there in the best way we could. He looked at the best things that he could do at the time, and she refused to be on because as soon as she had the first 2 questions, they were very accusatory. She'd have just loved to have seen something like this, but she was at the 115 now. So.
Well, he headhunted, he wanted to teach nurses, and he headhunted, oh God, what was Beatrice's name? Charlotte Beaconsfield, I think her name was, and she'd been trained by Florence Nightingale, and she started the first nursing training for mental health nurses at Seacliff, and then they started the nursing registration, and they wanted 3 nurses, 3 of the best nurses in New Zealand, to start that off, and she was chosen. So, you know, everything he did possible to make sure things went right.
And she married late, so she probably worked right up until the, perhaps the end of the late 40s, because my cousin is only 10 years older than me.
When he went there, a married woman, if you got married, you weren't allowed to work.
Right, yes.
Until the war happened and 79 men left Seacliff, so the married woman were quickly.
Any other questions? I personally found this so fascinating because I had a relative that went to Seacliff and it was never ever talked about. And then I went and got his records and he was put on because his mother found him difficult to cope with, because all the time he set fire to a bit of tussock. And I could never, you know, nowadays never ever, and I saw that where it was signed by the doctor and 2 people to put him in, and I'm really sad. But that was fabulous. And thank you so much. And
Well, the story's bigger than that, there's much more.
And if anyone wants to see it again, I don't know if you realise, but 1 week after we have Tuesday clubs, they're online on YouTube and you can access them by the Toitū website, and they're really fabulous. If anyone wants to see them and they're not here or up in town, you can direct them to them, so they go up usually a week afterwards. Sometimes a day or 2 later, but usually a week afterwards they're on YouTube.